Alright, so we've spent the last few videos talking about Mike's PhD thesis being a disaster with typos, impossible data, and a spacebar that took frequent vacations. But here's the thing that makes it even funnier. This man talks like he's swallowed a thesaurus whole and is trying to escape through his mouth one pretentious word at a time. Someone made a compilation of Mike using the most unnecessarily complicated words possible, and I need to talk about it because it perfectly captures why his thesis was such a mess. This man is so busy trying to sound smart that he forgot to actually be smart. Let's watch a guy with a keyboard submerged in cement try to prove his 160 IQ through vocabulary alone.
This has been a passion of mine for a long time because I'm an astute, dilettante, delusional, recreational student of economics.
I'm sorry, what? You're an astute dilettante. Brother, do you know what dilettante means? It means amateur. It means dabbler. You just called yourself a smart amateur, which is like saying you're an expert beginner. And then you immediately call yourself delusional, which, okay, at least that part's accurate. But why are you using 4 words when I like economics would have done the job? This is what happens when you care more about sounding intelligent than actually communicating. You end up with word salad that technically makes sense but sounds like a robot learned English from Victorian literature and LinkedIn thought leader posts.
Foods with lots of protein in them ideally should be consumed 3 to 5 times per day at roughly equidistant intervals.
Equidistant intervals. Equal distant intervals. My man, you could have just said eat protein every few hours. But no, we need to break out the geometry terms. Your meals aren't mathematical coordinates. They're food. Nobody's measuring the distance between breakfast and lunch with a protractor. This is like telling someone, please ambulate your physical form to the nearest hydration receptacle and consume dihydrogen monoxide when you mean go drink some water.
An exponentially de-escalating amount of impressive differences.
People like to envision that poor people are all relatively homogenous. That's absolutely not true. We can at least bifurcate them into 2 categories.
Bifurcate. He said bifurcate instead of split into 2. That's not being smart. That's being insufferable. That's what happens when you're so desperate to flex your vocabulary that you forget people just want to understand what you're saying. Here's the test. If you can replace your word with a simpler one and lose nothing but pretension, you're not being smart. You're being a dick. And here's what makes this absolutely hilarious. This is the same guy whose PhD thesis, spelled science is sense, used middle thing pull instead of mid-thigh pull, had missing spaces everywhere because apparently the spacebar was optional, copy-pasted the same errors numerous times. So you're telling me this man can use words like progenitors and deleterious and ethnographic in casual conversation, but his actual academic work looks like it was written by someone who just discovered Microsoft Word exists? That's not an accident. That's someone who knows big words but can't be bothered with basics like spellcheck and proofreading. It's like showing up to a job interview in a tuxedo, but you forgot to wear pants.
And I found it mostly bereft of any substance whatsoever. It was just like legitimately an ad hominem attack writ large.
Bereft. Where's the last time you heard someone say bereft in real conversation? Sorry, bro, I'm bereft of protein powder. This gym is bereft of squat racks. Nobody talks like this unless they're trying really, really hard.
I have been perusing various fields of literature to try to align my ideas on the subject. It can actually physically result in the promulgation of more overreaching type of escalating fatigue.
What the fuck does this even mean? The promulgation. My God, you're talking about working out, not drafting international law. Just say causing more fatigue. That's it. 3 words. Done. But no, we need promulgation because apparently Mike's allergic to being understood on the first try.
And the reality is that many people like to engender ideas of who they're helping, having met very few or none of the people who they're actually trying to help.
Engender. Nobody engenders anything except maybe children. You don't engender ideas, you have ideas. You form ideas. You don't need to conjugate your way through every sentence like you're translating from Latin. Look, using big words isn't inherently bad. Sometimes a complex word is the right word. Sometimes it captures something simpler words can't. But that's not what Mike is doing. Mike is playing Mad Libs with the Thesaurus. He's taking perfectly clear sentences and running them through a make me sound smart filter until they become incomprehensible verbal sludge.
There are several candidate mechanisms being investigated, and I can regale you with the details, but it's a little bit pointless.
I can regale you. My brother, in Christ, you're not a medieval bard. You're not regaling anyone. You're explaining. Explaining. That's the word. It's right there. Free. Available. But nope. Gotta regale people because saying I can explain doesn't make you sound like you have 160 IQ. And this is the exact problem with his thesis. He was so busy trying to sound like an academic that he forgot to actually do the academic work. The vocabulary was there, the effort wasn't. Let me show you the pattern here.
One of the main progenitors of this idea that AGI is coming much sooner than people think, his original prognostication date was 2030.
Deleterious eating disorders, anorexia nervosa, seen not exclusively, but almost exclusively in females of reproductive age.
People with low trait conscientiousness are going to live their lives in different ways and face a cacophony of problems that don't occur to people of high conscientiousness.
If they're actually meant as affronts, you tend to catastrophize them in your head.
Well, why don't you delineate for me what's cool and what's not cool in bro code? And when you finish that delineation post.
So what we see is a very homogeneous rate overall. Now, there are absolutely declivities and proclivities throughout, but in the grand historical sense. But it's more sad to watch their ontological understanding of the world collapse. I have an exact counterpoint to that as an intellectual exercise. If you have no impetus,
they're not going to elevate your shape very likely. At the very least, it'll be highly inefficient and incredibly discomforting for what you'd have to do with such dumbbells.
And so the entire profession has been coalescing into more and more aggressive prediction timelines.
Mm-hmm. And in reference to an ethereal make-believe comparator population in your head.
Just on very carte blanche levels of thinking, it becomes less likely to be true. And a lot of good meta-analytic data has been synthesized. Probably as you scale up your intelligence, your emotional reasoning tends to capture less and less of your cognitive bandwidth.
I don't know if I agree with that.
It's just demonstrably true empirically.
Physical qualities that can be measured almost in like a fluid dynamics terms, like viscosity and hysteresis and all that stuff.
They don't have the neural architecture to think of the future, mostly because they don't have a well-developed prefrontal cortex. The list technically of troubleshooting ideas is kind of infinite. So prefrontal cortical development is probably really, really tied causatively to conscientiousness.
An exponentially de-escalating amount of impressive differences.
But you can measure conscientiousness through a variety of behaviors in an ethnographic context.
Huge proportion of psychological proclivities are genetic.
They are attractors for them, and they are the progenitors of many of these bad circumstances. Trauma doesn't come from the ether.
And I was starting to become a kind of an educator in fitness and a promulgator of opinion.
We're speaking in statistical generalities, so we're not trying to paint an entire group of people anyway. The group of people we're painting is also a statistical abstraction. Your injury probability, at least nominally, on theoretical grounds, will reduce. Massive bias in their thinking and in their choice structure.
The emotional regulation of it all.
Sure. The emotional regulation presupposes there is a desire to regulate emotion.
A disassociation from any objective reality about how much muscle you actually have.
Of which I'm not familiar with any serious behavioral geneticist that cites research to that effect. You can start with the supposition that it's whatever exercise nominally targets the muscle you want to grow. The conventional wisdom on how education works and how upbringing works cannot possibly survive the rigorous data that shows that, for example, as I stated just now, food choice proclivity has almost nothing to do with a common home environment.
Your proclivity to falling into honor culture-like behavioral patterns and thought patterns increases to an enormous extent.
I like to take holistic approaches. I like to understand the landscape of the entire issue we're dealing with before going and rendering very, very confident conclusions.
And I'm at the extreme end of masculinity brain-wise to begin with.
And then they're going to have extra adiposity and struggle with it. However, unless you become profoundly obese as a child, childhood overweightness generally resolves itself as teens mature into adults, because unless you continue on the path of egregious overeating, more or less you can grow out of considerable chubbiness as you get older.
They have all these kind of a constellation of ideas Economist and philosopher Thomas Sowell calls them notions. So if you have a hierarchy of understanding,
Systemic fatigue is higher. So you do what's called exercise deletion and replacement. So we have to understand the entire topography, the landscape of what we're dealing with, and have to accept straight up that many of the core, most explanatory reasons for why poverty and obesity correlate with each other are outside of our ability to have traction on them in the modern timeline.
might play a causal mechanistic role in generating more muscle growth.
Ask yourself a philosophical question. If you're used to some shit and it's no longer experientially challenging for you,
A retrospective analysis of why you do things is almost always grotesquely flawed.
I always go back and forth in my head as to which one is more effectual, conscientiousness or intelligence. But together, they are the single biggest effector variables for everything else that happens in your life.
Every single one of these could be simpler, clearer, and more effective. But simple doesn't make you sound like the smartest guy in the room, does it? And that's Mike's whole brand. Sound smart, look jacked, hope nobody checks your work. Because if they do, like Solomon did with that thesis, they're going to find out the vocabulary was a smokescreen for substance that isn't there. Now, you might be thinking, Cirque, who cares if he uses big words? At least he's trying to sound educated. And yeah, sure. Except when you're building your entire brand on being an intellectual, on having a PhD, on being smarter than everyone else, and then your actual academic work is riddled with errors that a spell checker would catch, the fancy vocabulary becomes a problem because it reveals what's actually happening. Mike isn't smart trying to communicate, he's trying to appear smart without doing the work. Big words are cheaper than big ideas. Complicated sentences are easier than correct data.
I'm both on a raw IQ scale smarter than almost every coach, maybe every coach. And I know more about physiology, body responses, etc. than they do.
Because I've taken enough IQ tests, and you can only write so many books and be on so many podcasts until people are like, you're pretty smart. I've taken the Raven's Advanced Progressive Matrices test, and I pegged it scale high. So you get every single question right. And so my IQ is above 160. We don't know how high because they don't do standardized IQ tests above that. You do that enough times, enough PhD programs, enough book, enough teaching awards, enough authorships, enough all the stuff, enough millions and app designs and all the stuff, and dealing with otherwise really smart people, and they walk away being like, that guy's real smart.
This is a guy who claims to have an IQ over 160, who tells everyone he's smarter than basically everyone, who constantly name drops his PhD, and his thesis had athletes who were negative years old, and he doesn't know when to use a spacebar. The vocabulary isn't confidence, it's compensation, it's a shield, it's please don't look too closely at my actual work, just impress B by how I talk about it.
This sounds so pretentious. I can't believe I'm using this nomenclature, but
Oh, so you know you sound pretentious. You're aware that you're using unnecessary vocabulary, and you do it anyway because why? Because sounding smart is more important than being understood? That's not intelligence. That's insecurity wearing a vocabulary costume. Actual smart people can explain complex things simply. Einstein said if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. Mike can't even explain protein timing without bringing up equidistant intervals. The funniest part about this compilation is that when you hear it all together, it stops sounding smart and starts sounding like a parody, like someone's doing a bit. Like, what if we made the most pretentious fitness advice possible? It's like he's playing Scrabble, but with conversation, just collecting the highest point words, irrespective of whether they fit. Look, Mike's gonna keep talking like this because it worked for his audience. People who want to feel smart by association eat this shit up. Oh, he uses big words, he must know what he's talking about. But now that we've seen his thesis, the thing that's supposed to prove he deserves those big words, we know better. The vocabulary was always a distraction, a magic trick. Look at the complicated words while ignoring the impossible data and missing spacebars. So, next time you hear someone using unnecessarily complex language to explain simple concepts, ask yourself, are they smart or are they just trying to sound smart? Because there's a big difference and Mike's thesis proves it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go promulgate some hypertrophic stimuli through systematic application of progressive mechanical tension while maintaining adequate recuperative intervals to avoid deleterious accumulation of systemic fatigue. Translation, I'm going to go lift some weights. I'm Zerk, and I'll see you in the next one, where hopefully we can talk about something other than this man's decade-long commitment to sounding smarter than he actually is. Peace out.